Today's discussion, as mentioned before, explores the theme, a growth model that works for today's economy. And to lead this conversation, please welcome onto the stage our moderator, Professor of Economics and Director of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research Institute at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, Professor Shiro Armstrong. Please give a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much. What an honor it is to be up here to moderate this next plenary session. Can I please welcome my fellow panelists on the stage? We've got very little time, and as you'll see, we have a very large panel to tackle this really important question, a growth model that works for today's economy. So I'll, in a second, briefly introduce our panelists as they make their way up here. But really, Ibu Mari Pangestu set the scene very nicely, and I hope this panel discussion can dig more deeply into some of the important issues that she raised. So let me introduce our panelists. Many of them need no introduction, and longer bios are, of course, available to everybody. But let me start first with Marc Mealy, Executive Vice President of Research and Chief Policy Officer at the US ASEAN Business Council, to the far right. Next to Marc is Professor Arief Anshory Yusuf, who's a member of the National Economic Council, or DEN. Then we have Bambang Brodjonegoro, who's a Dean and CEO of ADBI, the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. Followed by Chapman Taylor, who's on the board of is Board of Advisor of Danantara, and then David Knight, Lead Country Economist for Indonesia and Timor-Leste at the World Bank, and last but not least, next to me here, Dr. Peng, Chairman of the East Asian Institute at National University of Singapore. So, as we've heard, and as explained so eloquently, Indonesia, like the rest of us, confronts greater volatility, technological disruption, and policy complexity. So traditional growth models are being tested. What we want to do in this session is explore how we can reinvent growth models, or what we need to do to tweak our institutions and so forth for these new circumstances. So how can the government harness private enterprise, deepen market dynamism, and align public policy around productivity, predictability, so reducing uncertainty, and boosting long-term competitiveness? What adjustments are needed? How can we shape incentives? And the important question that Mari left us with, hinted at, of the state-led and market-driven growth. How do we untangle some of that or understand it? And that's going to be very important to shape a more resilient, of course, and inclusive growth model for the next phase of development, not just in Indonesia, but globally. So let me start by going straight to Pak Arief. From a DEN perspective, National Economic Council perspective, it'd be great if you could talk about how to lift Indonesia's growth potential, to achieve Indonesia's ambitions to reach high income status. Over to you, Arief.
Thank you, Shiro. I think I would like to start by saying that the growth beyond 5%, even to 7 or 8%, is not just an ambition, but it's a necessary. So we do need to augment our growth beyond 5%. And I think there are two opposing views among academics of the way we see it. Some of them are pessimistic, some of them are optimistic, but I'm happy to say that I belong to the latter for 3 reasons. First, historical reasons. We did it once in 1980s and 1990s. We grow, I think, 7 to 8% with the right policy mix. That's the first reason. The second reason, by country comparison, even today, some countries like Vietnam can grow by 8%. So even today's president, we have today presidents of high growth among our neighbors. So if Vietnam can do it, why can't we? That's the second. But the third one is what of my favorite, data. There, the economic development literature suggests that the only way we can grow high for a long period of time is not through capital accumulations, but through productivity and innovation. And the data says that for the last 2 decades, there is an absence of that in Indonesian growth. Meaning that it's untapped potentials. So our growth of 5% has been reached without productivity, without innovations, which is actually typical of some countries' economic growth that are successful. So it means if we can have right policy mix, if we can focus on what's missing, then I think it's doable. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Arief. As you say, it's been done before, and I think a lot of people know the reform agenda. It's not easy to implement, but know the reform agenda, and if that could be implemented, of course, growth potential would be higher and growth would be higher. Marc, did you want to jump in on this?
Yes, thank you very much just for the opportunity. It's great to be here in Jakarta, away from the sub-freezing temperatures of New York City. 2 quick points. Number one, over the last 5 years, when we survey the members of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, which are over 180 American firms doing business in the region, we've consistently received responses from our member companies that there are 3 markets that really have kind of come to the top of the list, so to speak. And we kind of call them the VIP club. And they include Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. These are the markets where, again, we're seeing more activity, more interest on the part of our member companies. And when we think about Indonesia in particular, I would say Indonesia is not just looked at as the largest nation in the region, the biggest sort of domestic market, so to speak, but it's also looked at now increasingly as a region where we've seen progress, and whether it be on the reform agenda, in terms of industrial development agenda, but it's also recognized that progress has been a little bit slower at a pace, let's say, compared to Vietnam. So that's the first thing. And when we drill down a little bit further, one of the things that's emerging pretty consistently is, and I know there's been discussion about the reform agenda, there's one area of reform that kind of consistently bubbles to the top, and that's the question of how the government approaches the utilization of one of its policy instruments, and that's local content requirement regulations and policies. That seems to be one of the more consistent areas where our member companies say, Marc, help us understand how we can navigate that regulatory approach. Are there opportunities to engage the government, maybe to tweak, reform, et cetera, et cetera? And again, over time, we've seen good examples of public-private partnerships where the government has a local content requirement regulation, but has been able to implement it in a way that does enable international investment and business to grow. And I mentioned that little anecdotal story to say, as we're looking ahead, and last night at our annual dinner for this event, our friends from Danatara gave a very nice presentation around some of the private sector, the industry sort of vector priorities. And as we at USABC begin to share that information with our member companies, highlighting things like the real push towards the waste to renewable energy production, I can tell you one of the first questions interested USABC members are going to ask our team is, hey, that's an interesting area. We're glad to see that's becoming a priority sector for investment or for business activity. Can you tell us whether or not the government is going to require a local content requirement regulation in that particular sector? And so I think that's a telling story that there's opportunity there to really tap into these priority sectors. But again, the reform agenda has to be part of that process.
Dave, we might turn to you for the bank's view. You've done a lot of work on this in a recent report. Maybe just picking up on what Arief and Marc have mentioned. What are your views?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Professor Shiro, and thank you for inviting me. Indeed, we actually have a set of new reports out on Indonesia and its medium-term growth prospects, which you can find at the World Bank Indonesia website. Yeah, I fully agree with Pak Arief's point, and I mean, just to briefly restate that, you know, the growth experience of Indonesia so far has been really impressive and quite remarkable over the last 25 years especially. And it's progressed to upper middle income status on the World Bank's definitions faster, by the way, than most countries in the world have achieved it. So its actual pace of development has been rapid. And with that capital, that investment, that accumulation has seen increased wealth. And we also find that if you look at the foundations for growth and jobs, as we are sort of calling them nowadays, basic human capital, infrastructure, macro fiscal discipline, these things actually, Indonesia scores as well or better than a lot of its international peers on. And while, of course, these things are not perfect and there's scope for improvement, Indonesia has made a lot of progress and fares well. But when we look at the other measures needed, the ingredients needed for growth, especially related to the quality of the business environment, that is where Indonesia, across a wide range of indicators, falls lower. And this is critically a problem, and I think this session's theme is so relevant because Indonesia, all countries at this level of income do need to shift to new engines of growth. What has got Indonesia here will not and cannot get it to high income status because, as Pak Arief said, now the drivers of growth have to be increasingly endogenous, increasingly focused on productivity, expanding markets beyond the confines of Indonesia to accelerate development and innovation. And when we have been looking a little bit beyond the benchmarking at the numbers, at the firm level data, big data in Indonesia, some of the findings sort of support the opportunities and point to areas where specific impacts could be the greatest. So we find, for instance, that while Indonesia obviously has some very large, very prominent large firms, when you compare it to other countries of a similar size and of a higher income status, the large firm ecosystem is actually much less dynamic and much less productive than it should be. And indeed, when you compare smaller to larger firms and firms as they grow in Indonesia, they don't get more productive as you would hope, because that would be the driver of job creation, better jobs and growth. Actually, the larger and older firms in Indonesia tend to be less productive. And this points to a key finding of our work, that there is scope to improve the competitive environment. It's that not only regulatory barriers, but the way in which a level playing field is ensured and enforced. And this carries over to areas including the financial sector, as well as services and product markets. And I think just some other points that I think is salient here is this distorted and difficult private sector environment doesn't only hinder productivity, but I think that's also one of the main factors behind Indonesia's very high informality rates. By the International Labour Organization definition of firm informality, it is about 83% of workers are informal. It's one of the highest in a large economy in the world. And this in turn contributes to lower tax revenues, which means there is fewer resources for the government to commit to productive investment and to underdevelopment of the financial sector and the innovation systems. So really, I've mentioned a couple of areas, and we talk more in the report about some of the recommendations. I think, as Ibu Mari said, I think it's all known, and it's just putting another cover and some more salient and up-to-date data on it. But I mean, I think the main message that we put in that report is that, you know, Indonesia's growth aspirations and requirements are achievable, but in order to achieve them, they're going to have to be reforms, not only investment. And we find that through the package of reforms that we describe, which we estimate doable, growth would be 10% higher. So if you look at that over a 5-year implementation period, that could translate to 2% higher growth per year. So really quite significant. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Worryingly, most of the job creation post-COVID has been in the informal sector. So that 5% growth that's been relatively consistent and returned masks some pretty big issues to do with quality of growth. And look, this is where we might turn to Bambang from a broader perspective on, you know, what Indonesia has to do to avoid a middle income trap. You know, a lot of, you've got the demographic dividend, but if people are going into the informal sector, that's obviously a problem. And we know that you need a different kind of growth model to achieve high income. What can we learn from other countries in the region, but globally?
Yeah, thank you, Shiro. ADBI now conducting our flagship study about avoiding middle income trap for the upper middle income Asia. And of course, Indonesia is one of them. And the reason why we conduct this study, because somehow the East Asian miracle in 1990s suddenly moved to the Eastern Europe. So if we look at the World Development Report 2024 about middle income trap, out of 38 countries that avoiding middle income trap, almost half of them coming from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, and it must be because of the benefits of being the member of EU. So in doing this study, then we try to come up with some kind of champions. From out of those countries, the 38 countries, we pick 3 countries as kind of role model that might be applied for upper middle income Asia. They are South Korea, Poland, and Chile. They are coming from 3 different continents, but those countries are not small, and those countries are not a single engine country. I mean, for example, oil-rich country. They are not that type of countries. So if we look at those 3, then our short conclusion, let's start with South Korea. South Korea emphasized heavily on manufacturing sector, but they are not only just doing manufacturing, but they are trying to use their innovation through their high investment of R&D. And remember, the investment of R&D to GDP ratio in Korea is one of the highest in the world. More than 5% of their GDP dedicated for R&D. With that, then they can become, you know, the countries that avoid middle income trap in a very short period of time, relying on manufacturing, but also trying to increase the value of manufacturing using innovation. Poland is different type. Poland may be considered as like the most textbook approach of getting higher income, because they are the main beneficiary of EU. So integration really helps Poland to become high income economy. Plus, they have very strong human capital. I mean, it has been developed maybe during, prior to the collapse of Soviet Union. But after that, they use the human capital supported by strong institution. Remember, if you join EU, you have to fulfill a lot of requirements, very strict requirement. But it will help your institution. With strong institution, strong human capital, Poland now has the highest growth of income per capita in the world. They are now approaching South Korea, Japan, and I heard from the Polish guys that they might be they might pass both South Korea and Japan in coming years in terms of income per capita. Last but not least is Chile. Of course, not many Indonesians are familiar with Chile, but among these three, I would say Chile is closer to Indonesia because they are resource-based economy. Their copper is they are the biggest copper producer in the world, both the mining as well as the processing of the copper. But the success of Chile is not only because of copper. They have been able to use the technology to increase the value of their resources. Not only copper, but they are also quite strong in export, for example, of wine and salmon. So it's agriculture. But the main or ultimate goal of Chile is trying to get the highest value possible of their natural resources product. So if I have to choose which model that will apply best for Indonesia, I wouldn't say none of them as a single country. But I would say maybe the safest way, hybrid approach for Indonesia. First, we have to deepen our manufacturing, including downstreaming, following Korean way. Of course, you have to use technology, and don't forget, our R&D investment to GDP is less than 0.5%, even way below the standard of upper middle income country around 2.1%. So we are in upper middle income country, but I would say we are lucky to be there, not because of our innovation, but because of natural resources. So this is the reason why manufacturing, deepening, and downstreaming is important. Borrowing from Poland, institution. Because we need strong institution to ensure the policy continuity, coordination, as well as improving credibility. Last but not least, borrowing from Chile, then we need to apply the technology in order to get higher value of our natural resources, including agriculture. So don't rule out agriculture as a potential sector to support Indonesia avoiding middle income trap. Because some countries, including Japan, already proved that exporting agriculture with highest value, with higher value, will really help, the competitiveness of the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Pak Bambang. Yeah, to get to high income, you have to get a lot right, of course. Boosting the manufacturing, getting institutions right, and making the most of your natural resources, of course. And Indonesia has some very big advantages there, unlike other high-income countries and those trying to reach high income with the natural resources. So I might bring in Chapman here to talk about, institutions, resources, but the state government alignment and the views from Danantara, or how you see Danantara, but more broadly on this question of getting the balance right or the alignment right between the role of government and the market, and how to get these institutions right to reach high income.
I think there's been a long tension in this country between a sense of nationalism and control on one side, but a need for foreign direct investment to be able to achieve those goals. And if we go back years, that sense of control really sat on both sides of the FDI that wanted to control everything that it brought, and the government wanting to control everything that it had. And that model clearly did not work. We can all think of countless joint ventures that fell apart over issues of control. Clearly, if we go forward, technology has to come in. That's going to have to be brought in. Clearly, the government is going to need to engage with that through both the private sector and the public sector. But we have to reestablish that sense of trust and that sense of institutional governance that has really been missing. I'd like to talk about two examples where I think that's worked really well and show a way forward. If I think of Telkomsel and Freeport, two great examples of world-class companies here. And what they've done is they've been able to keep the Indonesian entity having the financial control, but they've retained operational control with the foreign partner. And so they've sort of got the best of both worlds. Now that doesn't always work, which is why I'm actually quite excited about Danantara. And I don't see this as a crowding out of investment. I see this as a crowding in of investment. Often domestic participants have been wary of large corporations who want to come in and obviously feel at a scale disadvantage. By bringing in an INA or a Danantara, you provide a counterweight, a well-connected counterweight. And likewise, the government can have those vehicles attracting foreign investment because clearly both of those entities have a strong vested interest in succeeding. And so I'm quite hopeful that we're going to realize that this needs to be a new environment of cooperation and partnership, and we need to stop arguing about who has 51% control and recognize where the strength comes from and cooperate together. And I think we're starting to see that. I don't know if anybody's from GE Healthcare is here, but I think you're starting to see some of that foreign investment come in and really understand that sense of partnership together and people backing away from having to have that control, because we clearly, there are clearly some institutional issues that have yet to be addressed, and that's a longer conversation.
So, the Constitution, as I was reminded recently, talks about the resources, of course, being owned by the state and delivering for the people, a key there in Article 33. And your interpretation there, of course, is like in many other countries. It means it's about sovereignty, and foreign capital can come in, other private capital can come in for delivery of, boosting the productivity of those resources for the Indonesian people. That all sounds consistent? Yeah, good. So the state versus market dichotomy has never really been all that, black and white. There's always been, you need the state to get the market right, of course. So I'm glad that
I think it needs to be a shift from an either-or mentality to a both-and mentality.
Yeah, and that's where the quality of institutions are going to matter for reaching high income. Look, we're going to pivot now to a broader look at the region, and Dr. Tay here. We heard from Ibu Mari again on ASEAN's response. In this new uncertain world where there's less predictability and more uncertainty, ASEAN has done a very good job of bringing some certainty to this part of the world, not retaliating on tariffs, at least rhetorically deepening economic integration, going back to Bambang, one of his lessons for higher growth. How do you see ASEAN now and ASEAN's role here in helping countries maintain certainty or reduce uncertainty and boosting growth, Dr. Tay?
Yeah, thanks, Shiro. I will echo what has been said, and I'm not going to talk specifically about Indonesia. There are experts here who know far more about Indonesia than myself. But basically, I think the more you get into the world of deglobalization, ASEAN needs then to create scale, needs to come together. So I agree totally with Marie that there's a need for deeper integration within ASEAN. And then I agree with her as well about, there's a need for ASEAN to be more green. ASEAN we have been talking about the transition to a green economy for a while. But it's a question of having something very concrete that you can work on. And which is why I want to talk about something that's a bit different from preceding speakers, which is about the ASEAN power grid. This has been talked about, the ASEAN power grid has been talked about for the last 2 decades, okay? But recently there's a momentum towards it for a variety of reasons. There's a need for ASEAN to work together. The other reason is that in terms of the green economy, as you know, the cost of renewable energy has been coming down very rapidly. But this is an area that is very ambitious. The ASEAN countries have been talking among themselves, but except for some patches here and there, not getting very far. And this is where you need to take a bigger picture of what I call, for a better term, ASEAN plus 3, okay? Because if you look at the division between, if you look at the plus 3, these are more developed, more technocratic, advanced countries. They are also net savers, big creditors. So if you can have a situation of China working together with Japan and Korea and working with the multilaterals, able to come together with a framework to develop an ASEAN power grid on a multi-year basis. And this is very ambitious, right? You're talking about multi-billion dollars worth of investment. But that is required. I mean, a lot of figures have been thrown around. These are real figures. ASEAN on its own will not be able to do it. I call this a Green Marshall Plan. And I gather from Shiro that term has been used before by others before me. But this is very specific on the ASEAN power grid. And the Marshall Plan, if you go back to the origin of the Marshall Plan, and I'm talking about this without the Cold War connotation, basically, people would just look at it from developing Western Europe from after the Second World War, and the benefits that accrued, it was actually to contain communism from then Soviet Union. But what wasn't seen, now I'm trying to flip it from a US point of view, it was of great benefit to the US economy as well. What was forgotten that after the Second World War, there was a big slump in the US because of lack of demand. So this provided a big boost in demand for US, and it also helped to entrench and strengthen the view of the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. This was, don't forget, this was the early post-Second World War. If you look at the situation, let me refer specifically to China, which has great capability. By a long shot, the green leader for the world in renewable. China has a big domestic saving rate. It is trying to encourage more domestic consumption, but it seems not to be getting anywhere. If you have a situation now where China can make use of its huge excess capacity in a lot of its areas, and its huge domestic savings to invest in ASEAN while at the same time trying to increase its domestic consumption, and using the renminbi as a medium of lending rather than the US dollar, because the renminbi, the interest rate is very low. If they are going to provide you with all the capabilities, the export capabilities, and they lend in the renminbi dollars, and I would say it should not be just renminbi, it could be other regional currencies, then I think you provide a certain buffer and insulation against currency risk, okay? So if you can do that well, I think that would be hugely transformative, not just for China, but for ASEAN, because we are moving into a world of electric green economy, and you're creating new industries with spillover effects rather than competing against existing industries. So I'm just putting that forth as a kind of big picture proposal, concrete on the table rather than talk broadly. I think we should get into the world now. There's more action than talk. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Tay. Of course, when you say ASEAN +3, that can be extended to ASEAN +5 and include Australia and New Zealand.
It should be inclusive.
Well, of course, but that does underlie the point of the complementarity in the region. And many countries are worried about excess capacity from China on green goods flooding markets. But really, we are under capacity globally on green goods, and it does bring big implications for the adjustment to some of these imports for many of these countries. It brings us back to what these new growth models will have to look like. So I think the complementarity there between these economies, some resource rich, some resource poor, high savers and so forth, and the different levels of technology, that's an important takeaway. We've got very little time left. What I want to do is come very quickly to our two colleagues on the panel who are back and forth between here and the United States, our two Americans, and invite either of them to make a mention of, what are we listening to out of Washington? Should we be distracted or just stay the course here? How does that change everything? That's a big question, but a very quick response from you, Marc or Chapman.
Sure, happy to go first. Clearly, global businesses, global investors are having to navigate these ongoing kinds of changes that are emerging. In fact, this summer, the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council is going to organize an event called the U.S.-ASEAN Forum in Singapore for the sole purpose of creating opportunities for ASEAN public and private stakeholders to get a deeper understanding of the new Washington and how the new Washington is working. So I just want to put that on the table. Personally, I've been asked this question a lot, having worked in the Caribbean, having worked in Africa, and oftentimes when I respond to those colleagues like, Marc, what kinds of things should we be doing? I often refer to the kinds of recommendations that USABC has made to ASEAN countries in response to that same question. And a couple of them I've already mentioned, but I would say number one, focus on deepening investment and public-private partnerships in the space of human capital development, specifically process learning, digital literacy, and curriculums. In fact, I would argue that if you look at some of the core elements of how Vietnam has done so well so fast, that's actually one of their strengths in terms of how they've evolved curriculums over the last several decades. Clearly, the pursuit of trade diversification has been a big one. And then last but not least, double down on some of these new growth areas like the green or circular economy that has already been mentioned. These are the things we've been talking about with governments and stakeholders in the region.
Thanks. Chapman, very quickly, I do want to come back, sorry, to Arief and Bambang on the local economy.
So someone who lives in Washington, D.C. and is never shy of all the hair-pulling events that happen, expect those to continue. But in my mind, this is the great opportunity for Indonesia. It confuses me that everything that happens in the U.S. and the market still goes up, which doesn't make sense to me, but clearly there have been issues here that have driven the market down. And it's very attractively valued. This is the opportunity to set things right. This is the opportunity to set a solid foundation. The response to the MSCI is sort of necessary but not sufficient. More needs to be done. But if that platform can be set, the upside can be tremendous regardless of what happens in the United States.
Dr. Tay, do you want to come in now?
Let me come in and support what was just said. I used to come from the investment world and still am. I think what you have now in recent years because of Trump 2.0 is an attempt to diversify outside of the U.S. Because the U.S. is seen as a more risky country now. Certainly for China, which has a big sovereign wealth fund called CIC, the U.S. do not want them to invest in U.S., so they are looking to invest their over $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund into Europe and into Southeast Asia. But in Southeast Asia, they see fragmentation, they still currency risk, market fragmentation, lack of governance. And for what was said, I think if we can get our act together in terms of providing scale, in terms of deepening market integration, and all the easy, low-hanging fruits that you can do, I think capital will flow. And if you look at the example of Korea and Japan in recent years, because of the improvement in governance being more shareholder-friendly, capital has been flowing in. So likewise. Thank you.
If we want to boost consumption in this region, that's going to require difficult reforms and integration. Arief, I might turn to you then. How can you unleash the private sector here? How can you respond to this uncertainty? We heard about local content requirements earlier. There's also uncertainty created by import licensing, investment licensing. Is it clearing all that away to bring some more certainty to investors, including foreign investors? Do you see that as a priority?
Yeah, since I know that most of the audience here from private sector, thanks for the questions. Well, contrary to, or counterintuitively, contrary to what people believe, the more advanced nations, the more government size, the higher the government size in the economy. It's counterintuitive with the fact that market mechanism has been the dominant economic systems, right? Yet, if you come back to my previous idea about innovation-driven growth, I think the mother of all innovation, I think, is private sector. Well, there are some extent where government can have a role, but mother of all innovations are private sector. So I think what we should find is the right balance between the state, increasing state capacity, either through Danantara or to whatever regulatory measure, the right balance between state capacity and the risk or avoiding state capture. Because once we get state capture, forget about innovation. So the key is to find the optimum size of the state size, state capacity, to avoid state capture. Because data says that most of the innovation or R&D in many OECD country are majority, predominantly, is from a private sector. There are elements of R&D where government can do, for example, a general purpose technology, but innovation are normally profit-driven or profit-driven, and you cannot have innovation compete with rent seeking. So just try to find that right balance. And in the Indonesia has a very strong democracy, and that's also create a challenge. Why? Because in development studies, there is a notions of democratic myopia hypothesis. Democratic myopia hypothesis is people or bureaucracy cannot see too forward-looking. So that's one of the biggest challenge. So I think then also this political economic constraint, we in economic councils, for example, there are two areas where we can have low-hanging fruit. If MSCI can force us, in a quote, to do reforms, then Trump reciprocal tariffs has all list of sins that we do. Actually, if we correct that, we can improve ourselves in many ways, right? Like non-tariff measures and things like that. That's efficiency. And also there are certain areas where we can a little bit relax in political constraint. For example, in the council, we have two areas where Vietnam has been so much aggressive is deregulations and also government technology. Deregulation, Ibu Mari has already mentioned a lot, but I think this government technology, we have a potential because this is one of the area where it has most politically neutrals or acceptable to interested parties. Government technology create rule-based, avoid discretions, right? Algorithm-based permits. So that's less politically constrained. So and also it's also in line with many of the, for example, World Bank publication recently, the Digital Foundation for Growth. So if we can choose this low-hanging fruit, then I think there's also this Washington dissensus, what some people call now, not consensus anymore, Washington dissensus, we can turn this Washington dissensus into opportunity.
Thanks, Pak Arief. Look, in the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap up now, but I take away from this panel a few messages that are very positive to me. I mean, all this uncertainty and this new world of unpredictability we face, the fundamentals still matter. A lot has not changed. It makes it harder, of course, but at 5% a year on average, Indonesia's growth is relatively high. And we look at all the challenges there are, that just means that the potential is so much higher. So I think we got a few hints or clear messages on how to achieve that. And one big message that comes through, of course, and we all know this, is the quality of institutions to reach that high income status and have a different growth model. This is where Indonesia Incorporated, institutions like Danantara are going to be important for crowding in the private sector instead of crowding out the private sector, and that's one thing to watch very closely. More economic integration with ASEAN, with the broader region and global economy. That looks very difficult when it's a hostile external environment, but you have a group of countries in the region that are all keen on maintaining development through economic integration. So really positive message, and if we can coalesce around concrete things like the ASEAN power grid, around frameworks like a new Green Marshall Plan, there is really hope of reducing that uncertainty in the region. So look, we've run out of time. I'm sorry there's no chance to ask questions from the audience. We've got some big signs here saying no Q&A time and flashing lights. So there's so much more to hear from our panelists, but I think that gives us some pretty solid ideas. We were able to dig down a bit on Ibu Mari's presentation. It's been really enlightening for me. I hope it was for the audience too. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you very much for moderating, Professor Shiro Armstrong, and thank you to our esteemed panelists. And we invite you to please take a step forward on stage. Please remain on stage and prepare to receive a token of appreciation. And to present the token of appreciation, we'd like to invite the chairman of PT Gunung Sewu Kencana, Bapak Husodo Angko Subroto, to please come up on stage to present the token of appreciation for our moderator and our esteemed panelists. Now we invite you to please take a group photo to commemorate this momentous occasion, and please smile towards our documentation team. Once again, give a round of applause. Thank you, our esteemed panelists and our moderator. You may now return to your seat.